Donbas will be a region without people. Once very densely inhabited area is now ghost towns and either destroyed or abandoned.
Your report from Bakhmut was published at the front page of the New York Times.
We spent some time in the bunker, met some of the soldiers. They were coming in and out from the front line, which was just a few hundred yards away. Everything was almost as if it were a black and white photo. It's really shocking.
So, hi Andrew, welcome in our office. Just a week ago, your report from Bakhmut was published at the front page of the New York Times. And you know that it's my hometown, and it's very painful for me to see how Russia destroyed it. So I want to talk with you about what you saw in Bakhmut.
Certainly. I visited Bakhmut with the Ukrainian armed forces. The trip was organized for an interview with the commander of the 93rd Mechanized Brigade, with Colonel Palisa. We traveled by armored car from Konstantinovka and on a route that the military uses also to supply the city and to evacuate wounded. At times they would speed up, drive very quickly over dangerous areas and past some cars that had been destroyed on the road and into Bakhmut. There's a lot of destruction all around the city, in the villages along the way, and also in the part of the city that I saw on this trip. There was certainly signs of damage in almost every house.
How long you've been there?
I think the whole trip took maybe 2 hours or 2.5 hours. We drove into the city and then really just ran right into a bunker, and then we spent some time in the bunker, met some of the soldiers. They were coming in and out from the front line, which was just a few hundred yards away, and having tea. I spoke with a cook who was working in making meals in the bunker, and he was said that he was very impressed and maybe saddened by what he had seen when he came in, by the destruction of the city. And I spoke also with a lower level commander who described the fighting, how it's very intense, and soldiers are usually working in small groups in abandoned buildings. And after these two conversations, then I met with Colonel Palisa.
Can you tell more about these people you met in bunker? How can you describe these Ukrainian defenders?
Some were older men, some were younger men, and they were in their battle equipment. They had their vests and their ammunition and their weapons with them. They were having tea. There was a little bit of joking maybe in the setting. They were talking among themselves, but nonetheless you could see on their faces the strain of what they had gone through, because these soldiers have been in Bakhmut for I believe about 3 months, and it's been a very difficult fight. So it was interesting to see them in good spirits, or keeping their spirits up, but also very clear that it was a difficult deployment for these soldiers.
And in your article, you call Bakhmut a site of some of the fiercest urban combat in Europe since the Second World War. For people who haven't seen these destructions, it might seem like hyperbolic. What does it look like from the inside?
On this trip, we saw the western part of Bakhmut, which is multi-story apartment buildings. And you would see many of them had burned or partially burned, so they were blackened. I don't know that I saw any building that had intact windows. Windows were blown out, and you see the curtains fluttering in the wind. The courtyards are covered with branches and debris, bits of concrete from artillery strikes. And there's just a constant noise in Bakhmut. There'll be a moment of silence, and it was spring when we were there, so it was a strange contrast to have some bird song and the first spring foliage on the trees, but at least every few seconds you hear gunfire or an explosion. So the scene is very, very raw. You can feel the combat all around. And when I was in Bakhmut in January, I was on the eastern side of the city, which is single-story houses. And I think almost everyone was blown up or destroyed, and there was lots of mud everywhere. So the combat, urban combat in Bakhmut has been some of the fiercest in Europe since World War II. It's being studied and analyzed by military experts around the world from this perspective. The street fighting is really an equalizer, so a more powerful army, in this case Russia, has to fight on a more equal footing with the Ukrainians, because there are so many places to hide in an urban setting, in a city, that the superior weapons, tanks and artillery can't be used always to its advantage. So it's fighting in small groups, using rubble, using destroyed houses, using high-rise apartments, and even underground passages as cover and as a means to fight. And this is really the scene that you have in Bakhmut, that it's difficult because you can never tell where the enemy is. There's so many windows and so many buildings. And really is the sort of the defining nature of urban combat. And this has been going on inside the city, I believe, since about December. Before that, most of the fighting was on the outskirts.
And you write that the most time Ukrainian soldiers spent under the ground, yeah?
That was my impression, certainly. We certainly ran very quickly from the vehicle we drove in on into the bunker. And you wouldn't see many soldiers on the surface. The city really looks deserted. It looks as if nobody's living there. You don't see any civilians, yeah? No. This time? Not this time, no. You write a lot about the commander, Pavlo Palisa.
In fact, he has been leading the defense of Bakhmut for many months, yeah? What impression did he make to you?
He certainly made a big impression on me. He described his role as commanding the 93rd, which covers about 70% of the frontline, urban frontline inside Bakhmut. There are other units who are also fighting in the city. He was sitting at a desk in his bunker with aides around, with video feeds from drones and commanding artillery strikes and overseeing the battle. He said he sleeps a little bit at night and then has naps during the day, as he's fully engaged in this, in the command of this very difficult combat. He had been, he told me that he had been in the United States studying before the full-scale invasion at an American military college in Kansas. And he had been getting a master's degree that would further his career in the military. And he had to stop doing this when the invasion started. He wanted to come back to Ukraine to defend the country. And he had a bit of a sense of humor, because he said that one of the topics that he wanted to study in this military college was urban combat, but he didn't have a chance to take that course before he returned. And now he's an important commander in this very sprawling and long-running battle inside of a city. You write a lot about the cost of Bakhmut for Ukraine, and the defenders who died in this 10 months of defense. You say here that Elias questioned the cost. Can you explain that? Well, there have been indications that the United States and maybe other allies, in a friendly way, in a way of consulting with the Ukrainians over strategy in the war, have raised questions about the strategy of defending Bakhmut. And a similar situation arose last year with the urban combat in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. And the concern is that Russia is a larger country with more soldiers, potentially more soldiers. So every Ukrainian soldier is more valuable than the enemy soldier. And the United States wanted to encourage use of long-range weapons and tactics such as strikes deep behind enemy lines and hitting supply lines rather than a blunt head-to-head fight with the Russians. This is what I think the discussion was about. From what I've heard from military analysts, a similar debate has gone on between Ukraine and allies regarding the defense of the city of Bakhmut, with some saying that perhaps it would have been better to retreat and not to fight in the urban combat in the city. And the Ukrainian publicly stated position is this has been a necessary battle, and also one that weakens the Russians before a planned counteroffensive, and that's how it's seen strategically.
And what's your opinion after the war you see there?
I'm not really in a position to assess, and I think the only way to really have a clear answer maybe would come after the war, when it's clear how many soldiers on each side died in this battle or were wounded, and we just don't know that now.
So you were in Bakhmut 6 months ago, and now. Then in your materials there were not formulations like dangerous post-apocalyptic cityscape. And many people compare the Bakhmut with Aleppo now. Did you believe that it happens to Bakhmut?
It's really shocking, and it's something you see throughout the Donbas in cities like Liman or Svitohirsk. You see these scenes as panoramas of destruction, where every house has been destroyed. You see, bricks scattered about, signs of fires and blown up military equipment. And when I was in Bakhmut in the summer last year, in August, the city was shelled occasionally, but it was still intact, and there were still people living there. Grocery stores were open, and I was driving there perhaps every other day for reporting. It's now, when I returned in January, it was obviously a significantly different feeling in the city. My photographer had photographed dead bodies on the streets from shelling, and we traveled into eastern Bakhmut to report on a drone unit working along the front line, and there was such a continual noise of shooting and bombing that it was really frightening to be out on the street, and everything was almost as if it were a black and white photo or a brown and black photo. Everything was muddy and worn down or burned and blown up. It was very, a scene of definitely of combat. Maybe even a post-apocalyptic cityscape is what you might say. It's a city that's been wholly destroyed. Sadly, for people who are from there, who live there, it's not clear, what exactly remains of the historical center. From what I've seen of satellite photos, not very much. On this trip, I was only in the small western area, still controlled by Ukraine, and there were apartment buildings that were still standing, but everything was damaged. It's sort of something that we've been watching in the Donbas for months now. Is that the Donbas is depopulated, that a once very densely inhabited area is now ghost towns and either destroyed or abandoned. And even in the Ukrainian-held areas, something like 80% of the population has left towns like Kramatorsk or Konstantinovka, Slavyansk. So you have at night whole streets of apartments. You might see 1 or 2 lights on, and then in the front line and in the trailing edge of the Russian advance, there's just lots of wholly destroyed cities. So the Donbas will be a region without people as far as the eye can see after this conflict. Certainly some people will come back, but it's it's a place that's been so completely destroyed by this conflict and by the 8 years of war before that it's hard to see that it would ever be populated in the way it was before.
But you are talking about the areas they tried to occupy. But what do you think about already occupied territories?
Well, our information is very limited from already occupied areas. Occasionally we're able to make safe phone calls to residents of these areas. The destruction is varied. For example, in Kherson, when Kherson was liberated, the city was mostly intact. There had been very little damage in the city, so that was positive news. Much of the damage occurred after liberation, when they were shooting into Russia was shooting into the city from across the Dnieper River. But then, obviously, from what we know from satellite pictures and pictures during the Battle of Mariupol, Mariupol is also something like Bakhmut, largely destroyed.
And you write that Ukrainians just cornered in Bakhmut. What do you think about this situation? This is a really small area now, for now.
It is. The exact area is day-to-day changing, and also closely guarded. The exact positions are not revealed by the military. Inside this pocket, you could hear small arms fire just hundreds of yards away in all three directions. And the deep state map shows this pocket getting smaller and smaller. I think the Russians had attempted to flank Ukraine in Bakhmut, had attempted to cut the road into the city and force a retreat. But in February, what we know from leaked documents that have come out from the American military, the Ukrainian army decided to reinforce this area to defend the road. And this has forced the Russian military to fight block by block inside the city and push the Ukrainian military back into a smaller and smaller area in western Bakhmut. And that's where we are now. There's a small area in the west of the city which is controlled by the Ukrainian military and an access road which is open and usable.
And after all you see, you talked to me about the rebuilding of Bakhmut. How do you see the future of all this region and all these destroyed towns without people there?
I think there's as strange as it might seem now, a very bright future for Ukraine. In security, one analogy has been Israel, that a very a country with a very strong military, supported by allies, that would be a strong security presence in its region. In terms of rebuilding, all eyes are on a very large sum of money, about $300 billion, which the Russian government had in American and European bank accounts before the war started. And this has been frozen for now, but there's discussion of using this to rebuild Ukraine. It's many times the state budget of Ukraine before the war on a typical year. The European countries have also paid attention to rebuilding. There are ideas about different countries adopting regions or towns. And I think that obviously Ukrainians themselves will be very motivated to rebuild their houses and bounce back. So as difficult or as strange as it might seem, I think there's a possibility of a bit of a boom in the rebuilding of the country.
Tell me more about your experience in this war at the east of Ukraine. You were not just in Bakhmut, but...
I've been traveling to eastern Ukraine since the late spring of last year after covering the fighting in Kiev. Initially the focus was Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, and then I returned in the summer and then in the fall to cover the liberation of the Kherson region. And that was very interesting to see these areas like Liman and Yazum after they were liberated. You got a picture of what had happened during occupation, some of the rights abuses, and also the very wide-scale destruction. I had covered Donbas also during the war in the east from 2014 on, so I'm very familiar with the Donbas. It's obviously now an area where there's just tremendous interest around the world, a lot of concern. People worry about Ukraine, they support Ukraine in the United States, and they're interested in reading particularly about this region.
Did you have any dangerous situations for your life during this work after the full scale?
Any travel into the frontline areas is dangerous and has risks, and I appreciate that everybody working with us, our drivers, our translators, are all taking risks to help get the story out. But these are obviously small because we visit soldiers in a position for an hour or 2 hours, but these soldiers are in these positions 24 hours a day for weeks on end. So the risk for soldiers is obviously much greater than for war correspondents.
Mm-hmm. But you have a special security protocol, yeah, for your workers, for your correspondents?
We try to be as safe as possible, and our general approach is that the risk, if there is a risky travel, that there should certainly be a good story as a result, that it should be worth it. If you spend an hour in a dangerous place, that it should have a story that informs the audience in America and in Europe about what's happening, and then it's an acceptable risk.
And what story you wrote about the east of Ukraine was most engaged?
I wrote a story about a tank crew in Vuhledar, and it was a story about 3 soldiers who were fighting in a tank and how they were a team together. They had certain rituals. They would pat their tank and talk to their tank. They would say, you know, please take us into battle safely. Please get us out of the battle safely. And I wrote a little profile of this crew about the tank fighting in Vuhledar, and this had actually a very large number of readers on our website. People were interested. Another story I am proud of in the Donbas was a trip to Святогорськ, the monastery, in June, just as the Ukrainians were being pushed out of the city. There was very intense shelling going on right at the moment we were there, and yet you would talk to the monks in the monastery with the Russian church, and they would say that they wouldn't believe that it was the Russian military which was shelling, even shells landing right on their monastery, and yet they were still supportive of Russia. You could tell that in the subtext of them talking, so that was kind of a shocking experience to see this aspect of the Russian church in Ukraine. And I wrote a story about this. They were actually burying some of their monks who had been killed in shelling from the Russian army in the monastery yard, and yet they were not critical of Russia's invasion.
Tell us more about your team, about the team of journalists that work in Ukrainian bureau.
We have a fantastic team. We have reporters and photographers who have lots of experience covering conflict and experience in the former Soviet countries, who have been covering this conflict since the full-scale invasion. We have at any time probably about 25 to 30 people working, including drivers, security advisors, photographers, reporters, local producers. Everybody has been working now for more than a year. The stories have been very popular because there's concern and support for Ukraine among our readers. Over the last year, 2 million readers would open only Ukraine stories on our website. They were only interested in this topic. Overall, our breaking news coverage of Ukraine has almost 1 billion views over the past year. So this team, reporters and photographers and producers, has been informing our readers about the war. We have a bureau now, and we have an office in Kiev. I'm very proud of that. It opened over the summer and is now a permanent presence in Ukraine to cover the war and to cover Ukraine after the war is over.
I want to ask you about how you headed the Ukrainian bureau in Kiev. It was a lot of questions from Ukrainian journalists to your Moscow bureau background and some phrases in publications and some publications. So how do you deal with it and how do you work this time?
I think that there are questions about how Western media covered Ukraine and covered other former Soviet countries in the period after the breakup of the Soviet Union after independence. The Moscow Bureau covered all of these countries, from the Baltics to Central Asia, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova, all from a base in Moscow. And this maybe wasn't the right decision, but this is how it was done at the New York Times and many other publications. I was covering Ukraine since 2014 fairly consistently. I covered Maidan, I covered the war in the East. I think that what I would like to say is that now we do have a bureau in Kiev, and now we are covering Ukraine from Kiev, and I'm hoping that people are happy about that.
And is it difficult to keep this attention to Ukrainian agenda at the New York Times?
It's getting more difficult. There was tremendous interest last year. I opened the website yesterday and scrolled through, and there was not one story about Ukraine. Republican Party in the United States, more than 50% of Republican voters, according to some polls, are not happy with American military and financial aid for Ukraine. They want to stop it and use that money at home in America. The Republicans now control Congress. At the same time, the war has been in a stasis on the front line. There hasn't been a lot of dramatic news, so interest is not at the level it used to be. This is an argument, I think, that the military and the government would be well served to provide good access to Western reporters, not make our job harder than it already is in getting this news out and making sure that people still pay attention to this story.